Hello, welcome back to another video in this series where I'm currently making a short Metroidvania game called Polearm. Things are coming along very nicely. Not really, cause I scrapped everything. So this is how I remade my game and brought the project back to life, turning this into this. And in this devlog, I'll share with you how I did it and my thought process on some of my decisions for the game. So let's get to it. So the first objective and milestone was to update the theme of my game, and it was done by upgrading my color palette. So I had to convert all my existing sprites and animations from a grayscale palette into this palette. I realized that restricting your palette to black and white while being good and efficient for a jam game is actually hard to use if you want to express certain elements. You have to be an expert in lighting and in contrast to pull off an amazing or even just a decent grayscale pixel art. So I decided to use a palette with at least 3 to 4 main colors with varying shading. I have chosen to not expand the range of the palette even more because beginners in pixel art or art in general are often recommended to restrict their colors to prevent coherency issues. So for this milestone, I need to convert at least the basic components of my game, that being the main character sprite as well as basic movement animations, the background, the terrain tileset, as well as some environmental assets, and as well as some basic enemies. This is for me to get an overall grasp of the direction of my game. So how did I get the ball rolling? Well, I just doodled some concept art and I eventually came up with my new Polearm. Even though I converted the sprite into a lower resolution, I think I was able to manage to make a sprite that has more character than my last one. This whole process was a very iterative one. I went from doodling some concept art to making the main character, did some background artwork, tried out some animations, then I checked in Godot if they meshed up well together. If not, I had to make adjustments to everything until it all looked at least decent for me. So I temporarily ended up with this scene, our Polearm master and this little slime, but the environment still looks very bland. I proceeded on working towards some environmental assets such as trees and rocks, but I think my terrain tileset still looks very bad. This took quite a while, but I eventually came up with these two tilesets which I used to create this scene. Then I added more background layers and made sure that these layers were parallax backgrounds. I think overall it improved the atmosphere of the scene and I was quite happy with it. I also scrapped the trees. I decided that I won't be using these as background items anymore since the forest background is already taking care of the whole tree vibe. I will save this for later if I wanted some interactable tree objects. And lastly, to spruce up the environment, I added some grass and rock textures. And this is it for the first milestone. It turned out pretty well. I think I have a slight grasp now on the art direction for this game. So for the next milestone, I decided that downgrading some mechanics of my game is the right next step. I realized that a projectile the size of Jupiter being hurled towards the enemy is a very hard concept to balance or design around. The projectile can even be thrown in multiple directions, and before you can throw it again, you have to pick it up. After some time, I realized that this was not fun. So I'm revamping the combat once again. The player will still have a melee stab animation, but for now, it can't be comboed and will be just a one-string input. And this time, the player now throws the polearm as a horizontal projectile. More information about this later. So about this melee animation, I've been trying to make a decent melee animation string for a while. It even covered up a whole devlog, but the difficulty of animating is starting to settle into me. It can be very intimidating, but hopefully soon I will get it right. So for this single stab animation, I tried employing easing and motion blur. Easing is where you make your animation start off slowly and then quickly accelerate. This is to simulate how much effort the character puts into the action. You could call the initial frames the anticipation frames and the latter the payoff frames. The longer the anticipation frames are, the more hard-hitting the attack feels. I also applied motion blur to make the attack more fluid. This is applied by smearing the image by connecting the future frame to the old one. But obviously, my application of both concepts could use a lot of work. For the range combat, the projectile direction is only on the x-axis. I also reduced the hitbox of the projectile. The polearm is no longer spinning but is instead thrown like a javelin. It also doesn't bounce off terrain anymore. So why did I change all of these? Yeah, I spent a lot of time coding these features into the game. Why would I remove it? Well, I asked myself, is it fun? In hindsight, hurling Jupiter towards a slime could be fun, but what if a player is asked to do that all the time? And since this is going to be the main mechanic of the game, it has to be simple and still fun even if repeatedly done. So now, you can throw the polearm multiple times, but you have limited ammo. Here it is along with a placehold indicator for the ammo. You can regain the polearm ammo by picking them up on the ground before they despawn. I could also tie it to a future mechanic, something like in Hollow Knight, where if you hit enemies, you regain some kind of bar and perhaps use that to regain Polearm points, I guess. So yeah, the main takeaway, I removed some ambitious concepts because I have not yet played a game where something similar was pulled off properly, wherein I also had fun. So retaining all of the past features was merely scope creep. However, I did retain something. I removed the polearm bounce from the terrain, but they do still bounce by throwing them towards the enemies, wherein the player could catch it. I decided to keep this because there's not much depth towards this, but it kinda rewards better skilled players. I adjusted the height of the bounce so there's room for the player's reaction. Also, as you can see, I added some UI for the set of the player's moves. Still temporary of course, but it gets the job done. But what is my plan for this? Well, I was planning to employ the same concept used in Ori or perhaps Ender Lilies, where a player has a set of attacks to use in a given scenario and it shows the availability of that attack. You can perhaps change the attacks in this set from the resting spot and use specific attacks which are perfect perhaps for the next boss fight. Although I'm not sure how many of these attacks I should be making, since this is after all a short Metroidvania. I think I'm done now with the very basics and my overall plan for the other core mechanics. But as you can see from the various sprite animations, a lot of it is still a work in progress. But let's say my game lacks a bit of what we call game juice. But we'll talk about that on the next devlog. So subscribe if you're not already and I'll see you on the next one.